Fort Ashby. The charge through the marsh. The smell came first, always the smell. Salt crust and iron damp. An old tang that clung to the brick like breath to a scarf. It was in the mortar, in the wood, in the wool of our coats. You could trace a day by its scents. Morning was brine and damp rope. Noon brought grease and boiled barley, sharp with the tin of mess cups. By dusk, it was sweat and old gun oil, and the faint, fungal reek of the marsh creeping up the walls. I anchored myself to these things. They were steadier than orders. The bell had rung at 6, as it always did, though no one needed it. Most of us woke before the hour from cold, or from dreams, or from nothing at all. I'd been sitting on my cot for a while, lacing my boots slowly, letting the day arrive in pieces. The barracks held the warmth of bodies and little else. Men spoke low, boots scuffed on stone, and someone coughed wetly into a sleeve. Outside, the wind came from the west, brushing the marsh flat. The reeds moved like a field of thin arms, and the tide had left a silver film over the mudflats. In the east, the sky was a pale bruise. It would clear by mid-morning, unless the sea changed its mind. Tommy Hale was already waiting by the tea drum, cradling his cup like a priest with a relic. "Saved you the last slosh," he said, grinning. "Tastes like rope and regret." "Better than soap and diesel," I said, taking it. The tea was warm, barely, and tannic enough to pucker the tongue. I drank it anyway. Tommy leaned on the wall beside me, eyes squinting at the marsh like it might offer up a joke. His hair curled under his cap, always slightly damp. He had that look about him, boyish, loose-limbed, too open for the place we were in. Most men grew tight at the edges like paper left too near a flame. Not Tommy. He burned from the inside and brightly. He pulled out the charm he kept round his neck, a small carved gull, smoothed by handling. "Reckon she's a lucky bird," he said, running his thumb over it. "Haven't been shot yet." "Yet," I said. He laughed, a short bark that startled a nearby gull into flight. "Don't be stingy with your hope, Mercer. There's not much else to trade in." We drank in silence for a while, watching the light shift over the flats. Somewhere behind us, a man sang a line of an old sea song, cracked and tuneless. Another joined in, off-key but earnest. These were the rituals, tea, song, the slow accretion of hours. They gave shape to days that might otherwise dissolve. I still kept the prayer card in my breast pocket, though it was more habit than belief. The edges were soft with wear, the image of St. Michael almost rubbed away. I'd found it in a ration box months ago, tucked between hardtack and matches. It had felt like a sign then. Now it was just a texture I knew by thumb. Captain Arden made his rounds late that morning. His boots were always polished, no matter how much mud he had to step through, and he wore his fatigue with a kind of grace. He paused near the mess queue, speaking to a corporal whose name I never learned. When he turned to leave, he caught my eye and gave a nod, formal but not cold. Arden was a man of protocols, but he saw people. That counted. A shout rang from the southern wall, sharp, commanding. That would be Hawk. You could always tell. He spoke like someone chiseling stone. I didn't see him, but the sound of his voice was enough to make men straighten their backs. Some said he'd been a schoolmaster before the war. Others swore he was born shouting orders in a storm. I didn't know. He was a presence more than a man, and we all moved in the wake of his belief. By midday, the sun had burned through most of the mist, and the marsh gleamed wet and deceptive. I was posted on the northern battlement, rifle slung, eyes sweeping the far edge of the reeds, where the land turned to enemy trench. It was then that we saw them. Tommy had joined me with a biscuit he'd bartered for, stale but precious. He was halfway through it when he froze. "What are they doing?" he asked, mouth still full. Across the no man's land, barely more than a smear of gray and green, two German officers stood atop a low rise framed against the sky. They weren't watching us. One held a small, square box aloft, and the other unfurled something that caught the light, a strip of gauze or paper fluttering. I raised the field glass, adjusting for blur. The taller man held a wind gauge. The other was checking a compass. "Measuring the wind," I murmured. "For what?" Tommy asked. I didn't answer. It wasn't unusual to see them observing, but this was different. They moved with slow precision, as if the sky itself had told them something we hadn't heard yet. A small act, practical and quiet, but it lodged in my gut like a pebble in a boot. Tommy shivered. "They're up to something." "Maybe," I said, lowering the glass. I didn't tell anyone else. Not then. It felt too thin to name, too easy to dismiss. But I kept the image in my mind, filed it beside the smell of brine and the feel of the prayer card. A detail like any other, but some details grow teeth. That night, after roll call and stew, I sat on my cot and watched the candle burn low. Around me, men played cards, wrote letters, mended socks with blunt fingers. Tommy carved something new into the edge of his bunk, a habit of his, though he never said what the marks meant. A tally, maybe, or a message only he could read. I thought of the man who died because I'd followed an order. It had been weeks earlier. A sentry post, a curfew call. I'd been told to fire on anyone crossing the line after midnight, no exceptions. The man had shouted something, English, I think, but I didn't wait. I obeyed. He was a new arrival, lost, probably. His name was Hutchins. I only learned that after. His kit still sat in the corner for 2 days before someone cleared it. No one blamed me. Arden signed the report. The rules had been followed. But rules don't carry weight in the dark. Only memory does. And mine was full of that moment. The shape of Hutchins falling, the sound his body made against the stones, the sudden, awful quiet after. I kept my posture straight. I didn't drink like some did, or shout, or weep. But inside, I had gone soft at the edges, like paper left in rain. Tommy tapped my knee with his boot. "You're off again," he said, smiling. "Only halfway," I replied. "Come back then. You're no use to us drifting." "I'm here," I said. He nodded, satisfied, and lay back with his hands behind his head. "We'll be all right, you know, you and me." "Will we?" "Course. I've got the bird, haven't I?" He held up the charm again, grinning. I didn't smile, but I reached into my pocket and touched the worn edge of the card. The candle guttered, and the wind rose outside, whispering through the cracks like a voice without breath. We slept light that night. The marsh was too quiet. Even the gulls had gone. Watching began before dawn. The marsh was still gray and slick, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched yourself. I stood on the east battlement with my oilskin collar turned up, boots damp from the night's condensation. The fog clung low and yellowish, not thick, but clotted in places like it had weight. The sentry beside me, Jennings, I think, was chewing on a bit of dried apple and muttering a hymn under his breath. He did that most mornings, low and tuneless. Below us, the reeds bent one way, then another, though the wind had stilled. That caught my eye. I tried to follow the movement, but it was like watching something breathe just beneath the surface. Not quite there, not quite nothing. No birds yet. Not even the stilt-legged marsh herons that usually stalk the shallows. A soft clink behind me. Tommy had brought up tea in the dented tin pot we passed around like communion. He handed me a chipped mug with the handle long gone. "Morning, Father Mercer," he said, mock solemn. "Too early for confessions." He leaned on the wall beside me, steam rising from his cup. You seen the water line? I nodded. It's got that shine again. Like lamp oil, or worse. Worse, I said. It's not natural. He didn't argue, just sipped and looked out across the flats. The German lines weren't visible from here, but you could sense them, like heat behind a closed door. Some mornings you could hear them singing. Not today. You know, he said after a long silence, I reckon the birds know something. They always do. Then we're the fools, aren't we? That's been established. He grinned faintly and knocked his shoulder against mine. Will says we're due for a shift change tonight. Might even get stew with bits in it. Luxury. We fell quiet again. A gull finally passed overhead, silent and low, wings stiff. It didn't cry, just glided inland. Later that morning, the mess hall buzzed with the usual rituals. Men folding socks like they were valuable. Letters wrapped in old ration wrappers. Someone humming a tune that started as Spanish Ladies and turned into something else halfway through. The stove crackled, and someone had strung a line of damp undershirts across the far end like bunting. Captain Arden sat at the corner table, back straight, logbook open, pen moving in small, deliberate strokes. He wrote like a man carving something into stone, precise and slow, as if the words might change what they described. I watched him for a while. He paused once, fingers hovering, then scratched something out and stared at the blank space it left. Will Hawk entered just then, carrying a tin of bully beef and a half loaf of bread. His coat was missing a button again, and his hair looked like it had fought a gale. He dropped the tin on the table beside Arden and said, "You've written yourself into a hole again." Arden didn't look up. "It's not a hole, it's a record." Will sat, unscrewed the tin, and began to eat with his fingers. "A record for who?" "The next man," Arden said quietly. Will chewed, then wiped his hand on his sleeve. "Then leave room for doubt." That made Arden smile faintly. "You'd make a poor historian." "I'm not trying to be one." I returned to my bunk after lunch and found Tommy there, carving again. This time I saw the shape. Not just marks, but a kind of pattern. A bird, maybe, or something winged. He stopped when he noticed me watching. "Don't ask," he said. "I won't." He picked up a folded letter from the edge of his mattress. "Got this from home. Ma's writing." "Good?" He looked down at it. "Didn't read it." I waited. He turned it over once, then again, then held it near the candle flame. "You sure?" He nodded. "If it's bad, I'll carry it. If it's good, it'll make me soft. Can't afford either." He held it a moment longer, then touched the corner to the flame. The paper curled quickly, blackened, then flared. He dropped it into the tin waste bucket and watched it burn. "I'll remember she wrote," he said. "That's enough." We didn't speak after that. Some things aren't meant to be unpacked. The day passed in fits. Rain came in a short, hard burst, and then vanished. The marsh swelled slightly, water lapping higher against the outer trench. The boards we'd laid to cross the worst mud began to tilt and float. I saw a rat drown, slow and twitching, in a puddle where there'd been dry ground the day before. At sunset, the German lines lit briefly. Not artillery, just a flicker, like lanterns moving in a pattern. It wasn't the first time. A week ago, they'd done the same. Flashes and gestures, men standing in silhouette and pointing upward, then downward, then across. No shots fired, no noise, just motion, deliberate and strange. I reported it to Arden again that night. He sat by the signal lamp with his sleeves rolled and a cup of something black beside him. "They're measuring," I said. "Wind? Maybe. But it's not right. There's no sound. Just gestures." He nodded slowly. "We've seen it before." "Doesn't mean it's nothing." No, but it doesn't yet mean something. That was Arden in a sentence. No panic, no assumptions. Just the weight of waiting. He asked me to chart the wind direction again. I told him it had been shifting northwest since midday. He frowned at that. Then he opened the logbook again and wrote, "Increased stillness across marsh. Unusual light patterns observed. No hostile activity." I watched him pause over the next line. Then he added, "No present cause for evacuation." He didn't say the words aloud, but I felt them settle in the room like dust. That night, Will pulled a stunt. One of the younger lads, Mallory, had gone near catatonic after his mate took a fever and was carted to the infirmary. Mallory hadn't spoken in a day and just sat, hands clenched, eyes fixed on nothing. We'd all been watching him, not knowing what to do. Will strolled in, set down a boot with a frog in it, and said to Private Mallory, "You've been assigned amphibious command." That got a blink. Then two. Will saluted the frog and said, "General Croker here reports marsh movement behind Quadrant 7. He requests immediate inspection and a tin of sardines." Mallory blinked again, then impossibly smiled. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The frog hopped out and vanished under a cot. Will shrugged and said, "Desertion. Bloody typical." Tommy laughed so hard he choked on his tea. I did too, though I covered it with a cough. Even Arden cracked a smile when he heard about it later, but the laughter didn't last. Around midnight, I woke and found the air wrong. Heavy, damp, yes, but not just that. It had a taste, metallic and sour like old coins in your mouth. I sat up, lit the candle stub, and looked around. Others were stirring too. A few men sniffed the air. One coughed and cursed. I stepped outside and climbed the eastern post again. The moon was buried in cloud, but the marsh glowed faintly, not with light, but with sheen. The water looked thick. The reeds moved with no wind. And along the far edge, where the enemy line should be, there was nothing. No shape, no flame, no sound. Then I saw them again. 3 figures standing in the shallows, gesturing. One pointed to the sky. Another held a cloth aloft. The third simply stood, unmoving. I turned to call for Will, but he was already there, coat over his nightshirt, eyes sharp. "You see it too?" I asked. He nodded. "They're preparing." "For what?" He didn't answer, just stood beside me, arms folded, watching the marsh like it might speak. Below, a ripple moved through the reeds, slow and spreading. It reached the edge of our trench and stopped. Will turned to me then. "Wake the men, quietly." "For what?" "For whatever comes." I didn't ask again. I moved through the barracks, touching shoulders, whispering names. Tommy woke fast, already lacing his boots before I'd finished the second word. "Is it time?" he asked. "Not yet, but close." He nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, he reached into his shirt and pulled out the carved bird charm. He kissed it, tucked it away, and said, "Let's not die stupid, eh?" No promises. We gathered in the mess hall, each man armed and silent. Arden arrived last, his face unreadable. He didn't give a speech, just looked at us, then said, "Double watches, rations packed, keep your masks near." Someone muttered, "We haven't had drill in weeks." Will replied, "Then you'd best remember fast." Outside, the marsh began to hum, low and steady, like something mechanical beneath the earth. No shells, no gunfire, just that sound and the silence behind it. I looked out again toward the German line. The figures were gone, but the water still gleamed, and the birds had not returned. Green smoke rolled in just after 4. It wasn't dramatic at first. No sirens, no shells, no screaming, just the marsh shifting wrong. A slickness to the air, a weight in the chest, like breathing through a damp rag. It came low, skimming over the reeds in oily skeins, hugging the contours of the land like it knew them. By the time it hit the glasses, the outer slope of the fort, the first line of sentries were already coughing. I was on the northern parapet when it reached us, watching the reeds ripple in patterns that didn't match the wind. Then I smelled it. Not rot, not sulfur, but something chemical, like bleach left too long in a metal pail. It stung the nose and curled behind the eyes, my mouth filled with wet pennies. "Gas!" someone shouted. Too late, too loud. The shout rippled through the courtyard, drawing men from bunks and latrines and mess. Some had masks, set in. I saw Tommy Hale come barreling up the stairs, still buttoning his coat, his mask hanging loose in one hand. "Get it on," I called. He fumbled with the straps. "It's wet. Use your scarf." He did, tied it tight over his mouth and nose, then pulled the mask on top. It wouldn't seal properly, not over wet wool, but it was better than nothing. The gas clung to everything. It moved like fog, but stuck like paint. Where it touched metal, it left a sheen. Where it touched skin, it tingled, then burned. The first man to drop was Private Sills, a boy who'd lied about his age and still had peach fuzz on his chin. He staggered 3 steps, coughed hard enough to spit blood, then went down with a sound like a sack of wet grain. Someone screamed. Captain Arden appeared near the barracks, coat unbuttoned, eyes scanning. He didn't shout, just moved quickly, crisply, pointing, directing. He caught my eye and called, "Northern Battery, check barrels. See if any primers are still dry." I nodded and ran. By the time I reached the gun line, 2 of the gunners were already trying to light the cord. One spark, then nothing. The fuse hissed damply and died. The powder was slick, not just wet from the marsh air, but greasy. The gas had left residue inside the barrels. I wiped one clean with a rag, and it came away greenish-black. "Can we fire?" I asked. The corporal shook his head. "Maybe once. Maybe. Then make it count." Will Hawk moved among the men like a man surveying crops before hail. He didn't shout either. He crouched low, checked boots, handed out dry cloths. At one point, he ripped the lining from his own coat and tied it over a boy's face. "Can you walk?" he asked one man. The soldier nodded. "Then find those who can't. Carry them back. Don't argue." To another, he handed a knife. "If your rifle misfires, this is what you've got. Use it like you mean it." He reached me by the northern line, breathing hard through a scarf soaked in vinegar. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "How bad?" he asked. "Guns are mostly useless. Powder's gone to hell. Some men can't stand, some are blind." He looked out over the parapet. "And the bastards haven't even moved yet." "No, just watching." He nodded once. "They're waiting for it to settle. Then they'll come." Tommy arrived beside us, pale but upright. "Reed lines full of them," he said. "I saw helmets, rifles, they're crouching low." "Any movement?" Will asked. "Not yet, but they're ready." Arden climbed the parapet then, wheezing slightly. His mask was off, not out of bravery, but necessity. The filters had failed. He held a handkerchief over his mouth and spoke through it. "We need a fallback line," he said. "Southwest trench is still dry. Move the wounded there. Anyone still walking, prepare to hold the inner yard. We won't hold the wall." Will glanced at me. I nodded. We moved fast. I grabbed Tommy and 2 others and began dragging the half-conscious down the slope. One man, Sergeant Finch, was clawing at his own throat. I tried to pull his hands away, but he thrashed like a drowning man. In the end, I shoved a rag between his teeth and bound it there. He bit through it, foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. The courtyard was chaos. Some men knelt in prayer. Others vomited into the mud. A few had stripped off their coats, gas-maddened, trying to breathe better, exposing more skin to the chemical burn. One man tried to climb the flagpole, shouting for his mother. He slipped halfway up and cracked his head on the stones. No one moved to help. In the mess hall, we set up a makeshift aid station. There were no medics left standing, just us. I poured water over a boy's eyes while Tommy held him still. He was 17, maybe. His eyes were the color of milk. Tommy whispered something, in a hymn, I think. The tune was broken, but the rhythm was steady. I didn't recognize the words, but the boy calmed. Then stopped breathing. Outside, the gas had begun to thin. Not vanish, just drift. The wind shifted slightly, pushing it south. We could see again. And what we saw was worse. The German line had moved. Shapes in the reeds. Low and fast. Dozens, then more. Will stood in the gate arch, watching. His face was streaked with soot, or maybe blood. He held his rifle like a staff, upright, bayonet fixed. He didn't speak to the men, just raised the rifle over his head, held it there, then pointed to the marsh. It was enough. Those who could still stand began to gather, not in formation, in clumps, in pairs, in ones and twos. Some had rifles, some had knives, one had a shovel. A few carried nothing but fists and fury. I joined them. Tommy was beside me, his charm tucked back under his shirt, face streaked with tears and filth. He looked at me and grinned, a grimace more than a smile. "Still not dying, stupid," he said. I nodded. "Just dying, maybe," he shrugged. "Better than waiting." Arden appeared at the rear, dragging a crate of grenades. Most were useless, wet fuses, damp powder, but he handed them out anyway. "If you're lucky," he said, "they'll go off in your hand." Someone laughed. It was almost a relief. The gas had made everything smell wrong, like rust and vinegar and rotting cabbage. But beneath it, I could still smell the marsh, brine, wet wood, the faint sweetness of reeds. It grounded me, reminded me this was real. Will moved to the front of the line. He didn't speak, just looked at us, one by one, and nodded. Then he turned and walked toward the marsh. We followed. Not a charge, not yet. A walk. A slow, grim procession down the slope, through the thinning gas toward the enemy line. They saw us coming. Rifles cracked. A few of ours returned fire. Most didn't. The shots were scattered, uncertain. Some rifles clicked and jammed. Others fired once, then refused again. We kept walking. And then, all at once, the Germans came forward. They rose from the reeds like phantoms. Gray coats, steel helmets, bayonets glinting. They expected us to break. We didn't. Will broke into a run. The rest followed. The marsh met us with a sucking sound, boots dragging through mud, reeds slapping our faces. I lost sight of Tommy in the first rush, lost my rifle in the second. I drew my knife, small, dull, but mine. The first man I reached was shouting something in German. I didn't wait to understand. I tackled him, drove the knife into his side. It caught on something, bone maybe, and he screamed. I pulled it out. He fell. I moved on. Around me, men were grappling in the mud. No formations, no tactics. Just bodies locked together, stabbing, clawing, choking. One man used a belt. Another bit through an ear. I saw Will again, was once. Standing over two bodies, blood down his sleeve, face unreadable. Then a crack, and he staggered. I tried to reach him, couldn't. A man lunged at me, bayonet high. I ducked, shoved upward, felt something give. He fell backward, gasping. I kept moving. The gas still hung low, clinging to the ground. Every breath burned. Every step stuck. The marsh swallowed everything. Sound, light, memory. When the Germans broke, it wasn't dramatic. Just a ripple. One man running, then another, then a dozen. They fled into deeper reeds, into fog. We didn't follow. We stood there, those of us still upright, chests heaving, weapons bloodied or dropped. The silence after was worse than the fight. Then I heard it. A low groan. Will. I found him on his knees, clutching his side, blood soaked through his coat. He looked up at me and smiled faintly. "Tell Arden. Charges ready?" I nodded. "They'll hold long enough. Then set them." I hesitated. "We might still..." He gripped my wrist. "Fort's lost. But the marsh is ours. Let them remember." I didn't argue. The others gathered what they could. Wounded, weapons, what little dry powder remained. Arden limped among us, face grim. We left the dead where they fell. As we climbed back up toward the fort, I looked once more at the marsh. It was quiet again, still. The gas was lifting, but the water still gleamed, and the birds had not returned. Bayonets. Through the fog, the path back to the fort was less a trail than a series of judgments. Which patch of mud might bear weight? Which broken board might serve as footing? We moved slowly, carrying what we could, dragging what we couldn't. The wounded groaned or fell silent. Either way, we didn't stop. Arden walked with a rifle as a cane, the butt leaving little divots in the muck. No one spoke unless they had to. Tommy was behind me, I thought. I'd seen him after the break, limping, one arm around a lad from D Company, whose name I didn't know. The boy's leg was ruined below the knee, blood soaking through a torn sock like a wine stain. I kept glancing back, looking for the flash of Tommy's scarf. A bright red thing his sister had sent, all wrong for uniform. But no one had ever made him take it off. The fort loomed above us. Dark brick, soot-blackened. The bastions pocked and broken. Smoke drifted from the north wall where the shells had landed earlier. It wasn't a fortress anymore. Just a husk with our name on it. Inside, the corridors were quiet. Men moved with the stiff, distant focus of the newly deafened. Too much gunfire, too much screaming. We passed a stack of bodies near the mess. Someone had laid a blanket over them, but not far enough. A boot stuck out, laced neat. I recognized the heel, Private Hensley, who used to hum sea shanties while he cleaned his rifle. We gathered in the central chamber, once the officers' mess, now blackened and cracked. Arden stood on a crate and cleared his throat. It sounded like gravel being stirred in a tin. "Charges are set. Perimeter only. We'll blow at dusk. That gives us 2 hours." No one answered. The air smelled of burnt oil and something else. Sweet, unnatural. The residue of the gas. My mouth still tasted of copper. Arden stepped down. "Gather what you need. Then we go." I found Tommy in the munitions hallway, sitting on an overturned crate. His hands were red, and not just from blood, the raw skin of too much scrubbing, too little water. His eyes found mine, and he smiled, tight-lipped. "You made it," I said. "So did you." He held something in his palm. A small wooden charm, roughly carved. The edges darkened with sweat and dirt. The one he always carried, a little fishhook with a twist at the end. "Still got it," he said, closing his fingers around it. "How bad is it?" Shoulders gone, a bit stiff. He shrugged the left one with difficulty. "Took a bit of shrapnel, not deep, I think, just enough to make me swear." I crouched beside him. "The boy?" Tommy shook his head. "Didn't make it 5 minutes after we stopped. Never said a word." We sat there a while. The corridor creaked around us, the sounds of final preparations echoing, Boots on stone, the clatter of canteens, the low murmur of last instructions. Somewhere, someone was trying to boil water for tea. The effort felt absurd and noble in equal measure. Then came the blast. It shook the floor like a giant's breath. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere, bricks collapsed. A dull, choking sound. No one screamed. We'd all known it was coming. The charges had done their job. The outer bastions were gone. The east wall split open like a cracked egg. The parapets crumbled into the marsh. The fort would be no use to the enemy now. We gathered what remained. A satchel of dry biscuits, a handful of cartridges wrapped in a towel, Hawk's coin, which I'd found near the infirmary sink. His body was still in the marsh. We hadn't had time. There were 14 of us still walking, 7 wounded beyond use, and the rest were quiet now. We left through the breach in the east wall, stepping over bricks still warm from the blast. The sky had cleared somewhat, pale and open, the color of worn linen. The marsh stretched before us, silent as a chapel. We walked in pairs or alone, each man watching his feet. The mud had thickened with blood and soot, and the reeds bent like mourners. Somewhere far ahead, gulls circled, the first we'd seen in days. I walked beside Tommy until the ground narrowed, and we had to go single file. He grunted with each step, favoring his left side. Once he slipped and nearly fell. I caught his arm, and for a moment his weight was more than mine could bear, but we righted ourselves. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "about that German lad. The one with the red sash. The one who didn't run." I didn't answer. He was maybe 16. I saw him stab one of ours, then freeze, just stopped. I could have... I don't know. I had my bayonet up. He looked at me like he was waiting for permission. And? I let him go, couldn't tell you why. We walked in silence after that. By dusk, we'd reached the tree line, the edge of the marsh where the land began to rise. The air smelled different here. Pine and smoke, distant farms maybe. We stopped beneath a stand of ash trees, the trunks pale in the dying light. Arden did a count. 7 able-bodied. 7 stretcher cases. No supplies worth naming. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands and passed it down the line. I sat with my back against a tree, my knees drawn up, the prayer card from my mother tucked into my breast pocket, damp but intact. I didn't pray, I just held it. Tommy leaned against the same tree, eyes closed. "Do you think they'll write about it?" he asked. "Probably. They'll get it wrong," I nodded. "That's the point." He reached into his coat and pulled out the carved charm again, pressed it into my hand. "Give it to my mom if I don't make it." "You'll make it." "Still, just in case." I didn't argue. Night fell slow and soft. No stars, just the hush of wind through reeds and the distant groan of settling stone. Somewhere behind us, Fort Ashby stood in ruin, or what was left of it. We didn't look back. Not then. We'd done what we could. Bayonets through gas, knives in the mud, a charge not for victory but for survival. And now we waited. For rescue, for reckoning, for whatever came next. The marsh didn't care. It held our footprints like secrets. The water gleamed. The birds were still gone. The wind changed sometime after midnight. I noticed it first by the way the smoke from Arden's cigarette began to slant westward, curling past the ash trees and toward the marsh. It carried the scent of burnt oil and something faintly sweet, not the sweetness of spring or fruit, but the cloying, chemical kind that sits in the back of your throat and refuses to be swallowed. We all noticed it. No one spoke. At dawn, the sky was the color of old pewter. I watched it through the crook of my elbow as I lay on my side, half dreaming, half listening to Tommy's breathing beside me. It had grown shallower in the hours since we stopped. Not ragged yet, not desperate, but thinner, like a candle burning lower in the glass. Arden stood before the rest of us were stirring, his uniform stiff with dried mud and blood. He didn't speak until the last cigarette was out and the last cough had faded. Then quietly, "We go back." There was no argument. We knew what he meant. The fort hadn't fallen. Not properly, not yet. The Germans wouldn't have risked full occupation while the gas lingered, and the interior charges, the ones we'd hidden, were still unspent. We'd always known they might be needed. Will Hawk had buried them himself in the floorboards beneath the eastern barracks 2 weeks after the new canisters arrived. He'd shown me the wiring once, proud and grim, like a father showing a child how to lock the front door. Now we would light them. We moved as a group, the 7 of us who could still walk, leaving the wounded under the trees with what little water we had. Arden left his sidearm with Corporal Dunn, a quiet man with a torn calf who hadn't spoken since the charge. "In case they come first," Arden said. Dunn nodded and took the pistol with a look I couldn't name. The march back was slower than the one away, not for lack of strength, but because we were walking toward something, not from it. Every step felt heavier. The reeds were slick with dew and ash. Tommy walked beside me, silent now, charmless. Fort Ashby rose out of the mist like a ruin already, its tower broken at the top. The western wall blackened and buckled. Smoke drifted from the central courtyard where the field kitchen had burned. The gate was gone entirely, a jagged hole in the wall where the charge had blown it inward. We stepped through as if entering a church, desecrated, but still holy. Inside, the silence was total. A few bodies remained, ours and theirs, though most had been dragged or swallowed by the mud. I saw the red sash of a German officer caught on the shattered edge of a stairwell. Beside him, a British helmet, half buried in sludge. I didn't look for the face. The eastern barracks were intact, more or less. The door hung off its hinges and the floor was warped from the damp, but the beams still held. Will was already inside when I entered, kneeling beside the far wall with his sleeves rolled up, prying at the boards with a rusted bayonet. He looked worse than I remembered. The wound in his side had bled through 3 layers of cloth, and his shirt clung to him like wet paper. His hands shook, but he worked steadily. "They stayed dry," he said as I stepped closer. "Lucky." He lifted one board, then another. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth and wire, were the charges, 6 in total. Enough to bring down the inner wall and ignite the munitions store beneath the courtyard. Enough to make sure no one used Ashby again. Tommy knelt beside him, eyes darting from wire to fuse. "We're really doing it then?" Will nodded. "We are." Arden crouched beside the doorway, watching but not interfering. He had the look of a man who'd surrendered command to something larger than rank. In that moment, it was Will's fort. "Timing?" Arden asked. Will exhaled through his nose. "We light the main fuse and set the timer for 15 minutes. That gives us 10 to reach the tree line if we move fast." "And the wounded?" No one answered. "Not immediately." "They can't be moved," I said at last. Arden nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Then we delay," he said, "and give them more time. 30 minutes. Will shook his head. "That's too long. They'll be here by then." "Then they'll be here. And they'll see the charges or they won't. But I won't kill our own men to deny them stone." It was Tommy who broke the silence. "What if we light the fuses, then go back and carry one at a time? We might get 2 or 3 out before it goes." Will turned to him. "And if we don't?" Tommy didn't answer. He just looked down at the floorboards. In the end, we compromised. 20 minutes. Arden wrote the time on the back of a ration label and pinned it to the fuse housing. "For whoever finds it," he muttered. I watched Will press the primer into place, hands trembling as he twisted the wires together. Then he sat back, breathing shallowly. "Someone else will have to light it," he said. Tommy stepped forward without a word. He struck the match on the stone wall, lit the fuse, and stepped back. The hiss was soft but immediate, a dry snake's whisper curling into the air. We turned and ran. The way out was worse than the way in. Every corner felt like a memory waiting to ambush us. The mess hall door swinging open in the breeze, the smell of scorched oats. My boots skidded once on a patch of blood I hadn't seen. I caught myself on the wall, palms scraping stone. At the gate, Will stumbled. Tommy caught his arm. "Come on, sir. I'll slow you down. We're not leaving you." Will looked at him, really looked, then nodded. We helped him through. The last 100 yards were through marsh again. The mist was lower now, clinging to the ground like a second skin. My lungs burned. Every step pulled at my thighs, the mud sucking like it wanted to keep me. Then the sound came. It was not a boom, not at first. More a groan, deep and ancient, like a glacier shifting. Then a crack and a roar. The ground shook. I turned. Fort Ashby collapsed in stages. The tower first, then the central barracks, then the far wall. Stone fell like rain. Dust rose in a plume that caught the morning light and turned gold for a moment before fading to ash. It was not a clean destruction. It buckled, resisted, surrendered in pieces. The last sound was the kitchen chimney folding in on itself, a final sigh. We stood at the edge of the marsh and watched it die. Then Tommy cried out. I turned in time to see him fall, hands clutching his side. A bullet, maybe, sniper's shot, or shrapnel from the blast. His coat bloomed dark. I dropped beside him. Tommy, his eyes were wide. Tell her I wasn't scared. You're not dying, I lied. He smiled, teeth red. I saw a kingfisher once, on the canal, bright blue, like a bit of sky had fallen. I pressed my hand to his wound. You'll see another. But he didn't. His breath caught once, then stopped. Just like that. I sat back. The others stood in silence. Will knelt beside me and placed his scuffed coin in Tommy's hand, folding the fingers over it gently. He earned it, he said. We buried him shallow, just past the rise where the marsh meets the woods. No ceremony, just mud and stone and a carved charm, which I took from his pocket and held. 7 of us had made it out, now 6. We returned to the trees. The wounded were still there, watching. Dunn raised a hand. Heard it, he said. All of it. I nodded. We waited 3 more days before a patrol found us. A mix of Scots and engineers, faces wide with disbelief. They brought stretchers, broth, questions. When they asked what happened, Arden said, the fort was compromised. Charges were set. We made the decision. They wrote it down. Later, in the clearing, I sat alone with the charm in my hand. It was shaped like a whale, rough-carved from driftwood. Tommy had whittled it on night watch, said it reminded him of home, of the sea, of stories his father used to tell. I turned it over once, twice, then tucked it into my coat. Behind me, Fort Ashby was gone. The birds had returned. The marsh began to forget. Songs for the dead, they found me half buried in the corner of a ruined cowshed, face down in straw that smelled of rot and old milk. Someone had dragged me there, they said. A stretcher bearer, maybe, or one of the Scots who'd gone ahead to scout the road. I don't remember. My boots were gone by then. So were 3 toenails. and the skin on my right shoulder had blistered under a gas-slicked coat. I remember only the light, that flat, indifferent northern light, and the way it caught on the broken glass in the rafters above me, turning everything into dull silver and water. The hospital was a converted rectory behind the lines, all whitewashed walls, and the smell of vinegar and iodine. I woke up there 3 days later, with a tube in my nose and a nurse humming something low under her breath. She didn't stop when she saw I was awake, just pressed a finger to her lips and laid a cool cloth across my forehead. I remember thinking she looked like someone I'd seen in a painting once. Not a portrait, but one of those pastoral scenes with lambs and a sky that never really existed. Captain Arden came on the 4th day. He looked older. Not older like age, but older like stone. Something rubbed smooth by weather. He sat beside my cot, with a clipboard and a stack of papers, and asked, very gently, if I could answer a few questions. I said yes. He asked what I remembered. I told him about the gas, about the rifles that wouldn't fire, about Hawk shouting over the din, and the way the marsh water turned red where we'd fallen. He nodded at all the right moments, said I see or yes, that accords, and wrote in short, neat lines. He didn't ask about Tommy. When he stood to leave, I said, "Sir?" He turned. He said to tell her he wasn't scared. Arden's face was unreadable. He nodded once, then left without another word. A week passed, then 2. The wounds on my shoulder scabbed over. My hearing came back in bursts. First the high notes, then the rest. I kept Tommy's charm under my pillow, and the nurses stopped asking why. One of them, a girl from Nottingham with a crooked front tooth, brought me a tin of boiled sweets and called me Love when she thought no one was listening. Sometimes I cried when she left. Quietly, into the pillow. It wasn't grief exactly, just the pressure of everything trying not to come out. On the 15th day, a man from the ministry came. He wore a bowler hat and a mustache so fine it looked painted on. He introduced himself as Mr. Edison and asked if I might be willing to contribute to the official account of Fort Ashby. For posterity, he said, a first-hand record. Your commanding officer has submitted his version, of course, but we believe it's important to include a voice from the ranks. Human texture, you see. I said nothing for a long time. Then I asked, "Will it mention the mud?" He blinked. "Sorry?" "The mud, the smell, the way it pulled at your boots, the way it kept the dead upright sometimes." He cleared his throat. "Well, we were thinking more along the lines of character, spirit, the resolve of the British fighting man under impossible odds." I reached under the pillow and handed him the charm. "Return this to Mrs. Hale, Blackpool, number 11 South Shore Terrace. Tell her he wasn't scared." He took it, confused. I didn't explain. They discharged me on a rainy morning at the end of March. The train smelled of damp wool and coal smoke, and I sat beside a man with no nose who whistled through his teeth whenever he breathed. The countryside blurred past the window in familiar shapes: hedgerows, stone walls, sheep with yellow tags. I thought about the kitchen chimney folding in on itself. I thought about Will's coin and how it had looked in Tommy's hand. I thought about the kingfisher. My mother met me at the station. She didn't say much, just looked at me, and then hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. We walked home through the drizzle, past the bakery and the chapel, and the spot where the old linden tree used to stand before lightning took it. The streets hadn't changed. And that was the strangest part. The streets hadn't changed at all. I spent the first week back sleeping in the parlor. My old room had become a sewing nook. The neighbors came with pies and condolences and questions I didn't know how to answer. Someone, I think it was Mr. Fenley, from the grocer's, said I was a hero. I nearly laughed in his face. The papers ran a poem the second Sunday after my return. It was called The Charge Through the Marsh, and it rhymed in all the wrong places. Called us the Undying Regiment and Sons of Albion's Flame. Said we'd fought with honor bright and hearts of steel, and that no man turned away. I read it twice and burned it in the stove. The plaque came later, bronze mounted on a stone plinth outside the old drill hall. It bore 27 names, not all who died, just those someone thought to record. It called Will Hawk a lion among men, and mentioned gallantry, sacrifice, the glory of resistance. It didn't mention the gas. It didn't mention the reeds or the water, or the way the mud opened and closed over Tommy like a mouth. They asked me to speak at the unveiling. I said no. But I went anyway, stood at the back in the rain, coat collar turned up. A schoolboy read a new version of the ballad, his voice cracking on the high notes. Captain Arden was there, in full dress. He looked thinner. When he passed me, he nodded. I nodded back. Afterwards, a woman in a gray shawl approached me. Her hands were red from the cold. She looked up at me and asked, "Did you know my boy?" I didn't ask who. I said, "Yes, he was kind. He laughed at everything. He carved whales out of driftwood." Her face crumpled. She took my hand and held it for a long time. Then she left. That night, I walked down to the shore. The tide was out and the sand was strewn with bits of kelp and broken shells. I sat on the rocks and listened to the sea. It was louder than I remembered. In my coat pocket, I still carried the prayer card I'd kept since before the fort. It was creased and stained, the ink blurred where my thumb had rubbed the edge. I didn't pray, not really, but I looked at it sometimes, just to remind myself there had been a before. Will's coin was never found. Maybe it lies somewhere in the marsh, half buried in silt, beside a rusted bayonet, or the broken remains of a field cup. Maybe it was taken. Maybe it doesn't matter. But I like to think it stayed with Tommy. That the mud kept it. That the marsh remembers. I tell small truths where I can. When the children ask, the ones who come round in November with their paper poppies and school assignments, I say Emes, he was brave. But he was also cold and scared, and he missed his mother. I tell them the marsh smelled like vinegar and death. I tell them that sometimes courage is just standing up when your boots are full of water. They don't always understand, but I say it anyway, because someone has to remember the way the light looked on the broken glass, the color of the gas, the sound of the kitchen chimney falling, the way Tommy smiled, even when he knew. Because the legend will last, whether I speak or not. But the truth, the small, wet, stubborn truth, needs a voice.